Okay, are you ready, Alex?
Yep, go ahead.
Great. All right, thank you again, Jordyn, for joining us this evening for this presentation. I wanted to share with everybody Jordyn's background. She is a PhD candidate at Purdue University in Indiana, although tonight she is talking with us from Pennsylvania. Her research focus is investigating the connection between melting alpine glaciers and mountain groundwater systems, specifically in Mount Hood National Forest and in Glacier National Park. Jordyn grew up in a small town in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania and obtained her bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering at Wilkes University. And while working as an engineer for an aerospace company, she took a vacation to Iceland and saw glaciers for the first time. And this moment changed her career trajectory. And soon after, she began working towards her PhD in groundwater surface water interactions on a project invented by her and her advisor, Dr. Marty Frisbee. Jordyn will be defending this year and plans to remain working in the water resource sector. So thank you, Jordyn. And we are ready for you to take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Cindy and Chuck and everybody else that decided to come and hear me talk tonight. I think it'll be really fun. So can you see my laser pointer here? Yep, okay, we're good. Okay, so the title of my talk tonight is The Role of Alpine Glacial Melt in Mountain Block Recharge. And so with that, I just have a quick outline here. I'll just go through, talk about the motivation and background for my work, site description, so Mount Hood, some science tools that I use in my work, the study results that I'll be discussing, and just some future work at the very end. So it's widely accepted that nearly all mountain glaciers are in retreat. Examples of mountain glaciers are like those found in the Himalayas, here in the Pacific Northwest, and also in the Alps. So this map right here, this figure, shows 41 representative reference glaciers across the world. So that's what all these little dots are here. And these glaciers, they've been closely monitored for the last 30 plus years, and collectively they, I don't know why it's not going next. Oh, there we go. Collectively, they all show mass loss amongst all of these. And you can see here from this chart that beginning around 1980 is when things really started taking a downturn, continuing until today. So melt from alpine glaciers is not insignificant. A study came out in 2019 that showed that alpine glaciers actually have a really big impact on global sea level rise. So over 9,000 gigatons of mass loss has occurred since 1961, according to this study, with Alaskan glaciers alone, so that's this one right here, representing over 30% of global sea level rise today. So what this means is that there are really large contributions from regions with less glaciation, but with strongly negative specific mass change. So such as Western North America right here. That includes, again, Pacific Northwest, Rocky Mountains, that kind of thing. So we can see evidence of this retreat in many of your backyards, not mine here in PA, but this is Elliott Glacier on Mount Hood. And this figure might be, you know, you might have seen this in the past, but this is, again, Elliott Glacier from 1901. And here is about 100 years later. You can see pretty much all of this section of the glacier has retreated back. There's a big tongue underneath here that is actually debris covered still. But in general, you can see how much it has retreated and deflated in just 100 years. So what's actually happening when a glacier melts? There's two zones that control how a glacier moves. That's the accumulation zone here and the ablation zone here. These two zones they're separated by this line right here called the equilibrium line. And glaciers, they advance when you have more accumulation than you do ablation. And same thing happens. So when you have less accumulation and more ablation, that's when it retreats back. So for alpine glaciers to survive, you obviously need an accumulation zone here. But what's happening as the climate is warming, this equilibrium line is moving upslope and is just causing the glacier to retreat more and more. So being a hydrologist, you can see there's a lot going on in this diagram here. But being a hydrologist, I'm really curious about, water. So where is the meltwater? Maybe this down here. Where is this going exactly? So glacial hydrology is becoming more complex the more we learn about it. The hydrology of glaciers themselves, like I said, is pretty complex. We do know that there is supraglacial drainage, so that means drainage off the surface of the glacier. So you can think of like snowmelt or surficial glacial melt. You also have subglacial drainage underneath the glacier here between the bedrock and the glacier. And then you also have end-glacial drainage. So through things like crevasses and moulins, and we actually know that they can connect all the way from the surface to the bed of the glacier now. So researchers have also recognized that water can shallowly infiltrate into moraine or alluvial aquifers as well. But this flow is thought to be rather quick and it eventually resurfaces. And so that's what this diagram here is representing. You have some shallow aquifers that can occur, or you can have, for example, this is from Three Sisters. So from a bit south of Mount Hood, here's a big moraine, and just beyond that, there's a glacier on the other side, and you can see a spring popping out here. So all of these processes, they do lead to the formation of meltwater streams. And these meltwater streams, they heavily contribute to stream flow in the summer months, with glacial melt providing 50 to 70% of the total stream flow of the Hood River watershed. And that's according to the Hood River Basin study here. So of course, during this time, there's also high demand for water use too, for various reasons. So some of these include potable water, irrigation, hydropower, protection of different aquatic species, and also recreation and scenic value too. So looking at a map of Mount Hood, you can see that the primary river branches, like the East Fork of the Hood River, are fed by streams that begin high up here on the mountain. So right here is the summit of Mount Hood. So just like we talked about, some of these headwaters, they're formed by glacial melt and snowmelt runoff. So as the climate continues to warm, the rate of melt will increase while the size of the snowpack and the glaciers decrease. So when the glaciers completely recede, we'll no longer have this long-term storage system that we're typically used to right now. And this introduces a potential sustainability problem. So a question that I'd like to pose is, what's happening to the groundwater systems in this area? We seem to know a lot, or at least more, about the surficial water systems, and much less about the groundwater systems. So there's a long withstanding debate that bedrock beneath a glacier is incapable of allowing water to infiltrate due to polishing. So that's like what you see right here. But we know that there's water at the base of alpine glaciers and that there's processes like basal melting and plucking, for example, that can create shallow fractures and imperfections in this rock. So right here, you can see if a glacier is flowing over this way, you have high pressure basal melting that can occur here. And on the other side of this little bump, it's called the lee side, you have low pressure refreezing and it can rip off chunks of bedrock essentially. It leaves you with, like I said, pictures like this here. But there are also larger processes, like think about on a mountain scale, like glacial loading and unloading that can take hundreds of years, but can really impact the bedrock beneath the glaciers. And this can theoretically propagate fractures in the rock. And this, in addition to pre-existing primary and secondary porosity. So that would be primary porosity is pore spaces between the grains in the rock, and secondary porosity is known as fractures. You can end up with, theoretically something that looks like this, really fractured rock beneath these glaciers. So the possibility of this deep infiltration of glacial meltwater has been widely ignored. But we're finally accepting that groundwater systems and surface water systems aren't really separate entities. They talk to each other and they can influence each other. And so here are two different conceptual models showing high mountain hydrogeological processes. I'd like to just highlight that unlike the figures in the past, like back here, these do include the possibility of deep recharge and circulation in the bedrock. So I'm talking about underneath here, over here, and deep in here, like I mentioned before. So these are the primary and secondary porosities. If we zoom into the rock, you actually have pore spaces in there sometimes. So returning back to this map here, I mentioned that some of these headwater streams, they originate from snow and glacier melt. But what I didn't mention before is that some of them are actually spring emergences. So the arrow right here, the tip of the arrow, is pointing to the headwaters of Tilly Jane Creek, which combines with Doe Creek, and that feeds into the East Fork of the Hood River, which is obviously a very important river. So this is what this location looks like on the ground. Let me see if I can get it to play here. Okay, so this is looking downslope right now. And panning down to the ground. And I sample in the summertime, so I've been in there like late August, also in July, and this spring has always been running every time I've been there, which is really cool. Those are two of my field assistants in the video as well. So you can see there's, I mean, it's not a river coming out of the ground, but you know, spring flow, if it's consistent, it can really contribute to bigger streams. So really quickly, I just wanted to talk about the formation of springs. So essentially spring forms when your land surface intersects with the local water table. So you can have different types of aquifers like you see here. So you can have like a cavernous or karst limestone aquifer. You can have a perched water table like this one. But in any of these cases, it's essentially where the aquifer is filled to the point that water overflows onto the land. And that's what we see as a spring emergence. So these, like I said, these springs, they can be very small. They can be just seepy, mushy ground, basically. You can have more of a defined spring emergence. And there's also springs that I've sampled that it truly is like a river coming out of the ground. It's amazing. Okay, so let's move on to large mountain scale groundwater flow. Here's a conceptual model for Mount Hood. The arrows here, they denote different length groundwater flow paths. So what this means is that you can have shallow flow paths, intermediate to regional flow paths. This is called mountain block recharge. And so if water recharges deep enough, this groundwater can actually influence flow that's occurring very far away from the mountain and even travel beneath smaller like localized topography, like you can see here. So if we have recharge, meaning precipitation that falls up here, it can flow all the way through this regional type of flow path and emerge very far away from its original recharge source. So right on that previous slide, we talked about recharge and where it occurs. Well, there's a saying that mountains act as water towers. And what this means is that mountains, they hold water and they slowly release it downslope through time. So globally, mountains, they comprise 25% of our land area, but provide water for 50% of the Earth's population, which is, honestly, that statistic is crazy if you think about it. People, they just live near these mountains and the water. So as moisture moves in from the Pacific Ocean, this is like a Mount Hood example, it's forced upward by the topography, which then causes it to cool, condense, and then precipitate that moisture out. So after this happens, the dry air then advances on right over the top of the mountains here, and we're left with a rain shadow on the other side. So really dry air. And we can see this happening in a satellite image here. There's Mount Hood. So prevailing winds are coming in from west to east. Rising air goes up over the mountain. And then here's your rain shadow on the other side. So as this water vapor, as it moves inland, its stable isotope values, they become lighter. So what exactly does this mean? We can use these moisture sources that are moving in the precipitation to track basically where the water is coming from. So essentially, you're looking at parts of the water molecule, called isotopes. So for this study that I'll be talking about today, I'm just going to be talking about oxygen 18, which is one isotope of oxygen, and hydrogen 2, which is commonly known as deuterium. So as the moisture moves in, the stable isotope values, they become lighter, as you can see here. And by lighter, I mean more negative. So right here, heavy to light. And as you move up in elevation, they also become lighter or more negative. So if we take a look at what this means on a plot, if we put deuterium on the y-axis and O18 on the x-axis, you can see that they will, these points will plot and make a line. So water that falls in the summertime here, this is warmer, it's typically low altitude, coastal type of water, it will plot up here. And down here is where your winter precip, so your snow, that kind of thing will fall. So this is cooler, higher latitude, high altitude, more inland. So in addition, if your isotopes, they actually can change through time as well, depending on if you're in a glacial or a non-glacial period. So this has a lot to do with whether or not the heavy isotopes, if they're locked up in the ice or not, or if they're not, then they're free to move around. So as you can probably imagine, the isotopes from these different sources, so in the past, like, you know, we had like an ice age, the isotopes then, they look really different than they do today, which is useful in my case. So the differences in these isotopes, they can actually be used, like I said, to our advantage to pull apart different sources of streamflow in glaciated catchments. So here's a plot showing fractional contribution on the Y, and on the X is just, it's basically a time series. So they did a sampling campaign of a stream, a glacial stream in the summertime. And here's the beginning of summer, and over here is the end of summer. This is just showing that they had a break in their data set. So by fractional contribution, I mean, we have ways of breaking apart total stream flow using these isotopes. You can pull apart the stream flow and figure out what are the sources of that water. So you can see here in the beginning of summer, your black line here, this is snowmelt, meaning that most of your stream flow is composed of snowmelt at that time. But as we go on through summer here, you can see the snowmelt, it goes down, and the contribution from ice melt, glacier melt, goes up. So that's exactly what I was describing way back in the beginning of all these slides. So they did this in a stream study, but what I did instead was applied this to springs around Mount Hood. So like I said, what I did was I wanted to set out to figure out what the sources of recharge were for all these springs on Mount Hood, because the springs, again, they contribute to stream flow, and therefore, to me, they hold ecological and water resource importance. So a map I have right here, these show all these points are samples from 2016 to 2019 that I collected with a bunch of field assistants, of course. So all of these points here, these are all springs and streams. I only have a few streams, and they were mostly sampled because if I couldn't access a spring, I would grab the stream water that was downslope from it. Here are my rain samples that I've collected. And surprisingly, isotopes are used pretty widely in hydroscience, and I couldn't find any rain isotopes at all in Mount Hood, so I was glad to contribute to that. So if we zoom in here, right here is Mount Hood, so it's zooming into this little piece right here. This shows my glacier ice samples. That was within Elliott catchment, Elliott Glacier, which I showed right in the beginning, the time series from 1900 to 2012. And then here are a bunch of snow samples that I collected too from all different elevations. And then if we zoom in even more to this little square box here, this is Elliott catchment. The glacier is actually underneath here. And so down here, I collected a bunch of melt from the glacier, as well as a glacier ice sample. Same thing up here, I got some more glacial melt and also some snow algae samples. So in the field, this is basically what it looks like. We all love field photos, right? So the three main tools that I use for collection are this drill pump that I actually 3D printed and wrote a little paper up for my first year in grad school. It makes sampling really easy when you have to throw everything in a backpack. So we have that, we have tubing, and we have a bottle. So here's the pump in action up here, sampling a little stream. This is what, for those of you who maybe aren't from this area, this is what some of the streams look like, or sorry, springs look like here, here, and here. Here's my lab mate collecting some snowpack for me. Here is an exposure of glacial ice. This is how we collect the glacial ice in baggies. We melt it down, then filter out of it. And then over here, we're just some precip collectors. So after I collected everything, like I just explained, we then take the data, or we take the samples and then submit it to the isotope lab at Purdue for isotopic analyses. So here's the data from all of those samples that I collected. And just like the plot that I showed way back in the beginning with the winter and the summer precip on it, my data plots along the same line. This is called the local meteoric water line or global meteoric water line. It just represents this line here. And so I have, again, deuterium on the Y, O18 on the X. And so you can see here that I have samples that are very negative, and there are other ones that are much less negative. So these represent summer precip up here. So this brown is rain. This blue zone right here is snow. And then this teal color is the glacial ice. So what I'm interested in doing, again, was looking at these springs, and just like that study did, they pulled apart the sources of stream flow. I wanted to pull apart the sources of spring flow. And you can do this using something called an n-member mixing model. So essentially what this means is spring water, it's made of components that are much like colors. So for example, if we have magenta, it's made by mixing equal parts red and blue. So red and blue here are the sources of magenta. So if we mix a little bit less red with a little more blue, you end up with more of a bluey magenta color coming out of the mixing model. So we can do the same thing with ice and snow. So if we put ice and snow into a mixing model, the water we get resulting is composed of fractional contributions from the different, from the snow and the ice themselves. And so we can use this mixing model here almost in reverse. So we can input spring water, and the output, the model, what it will do is show us the contribution from the different end members, which are just the ice, the snow, and rain, for example. So that's what the plot on the previous slide was showing. I'll just go back quick. These are the end members, the rain, the snow, and the glacial ice here. So when I ran this through my model, like I said, it's called a Bayesian end-member mixing model. I can go into details at the end if anybody's interested. But essentially what I did was put each of my springs through this model. And what the model did was looked at each of the end members. And essentially what you're doing is seeing how much of each end member is composing each of these spring points here. So this breaks down the results of my model. So each of these is one spring sample. So up here you can see this teal zone. What I did was made a cutoff value of if the model output that my spring had 80% glacial meltwater contributing to it, that was considered to be glacially influenced. And so the cutoff that I made for that was actually 60%, just so I could ensure that the samples that said that they were glacially influenced, that they actually were receiving quite a bit of water from the glacial melt. So therefore, like I said, springs having greater than 60% fractional contribution from the glacier ice, they're considered to receive a large portion of their recharge from glacial melt. So overall, I sampled, as you can see here, like over 80 samples between springs, streams, glacial melt, subglacial melt, all of that. And we found that 18 different springs that they were found to be glacially influenced. So what this means on a map here, I've color coded it. So these are the same images as you saw before, the boxes. So the teal color is the glacial recharge. So springs receiving greater than 60% according to the model. And the blue here that you can see scattered all about, those are receiving predominant recharge from snow and rain. So modern day precipitation versus old glacial melt. And so something I want to just mention here is you can see X's on a bunch of these, and those were present in a bunch of my other slides as well. So that is biodata. So a secondary question that we asked in this study was, how do the microbial communities of these glacially influenced springs, how do they compare to those receiving most recharge from the modern day snow and rain? So this came about because my advisor and I, we were trying to figure out, if we have samples that are showing, this is according to the model, showing that you have glacial melt that's contributing to the spring. Is there other stuff that's happening there too? Like, is there other stuff in the water that we could potentially pick up on that we could use as tracers that maybe are a little bit different or unique? This slide's a little bit slow. There we go. So glaciated landscapes, they used to be thought of as being really like biologically empty, but we've learned recently that they're actually really rich with life. And like I said, this can be used to our advantage. So Alpine Glacier ecosystems, they host really distinct extremophile microbial communities, and they're really associated to, or they're isolated to these unique specific polar alpine regions. So you'll find things, for example, in Mount Hood that you won't necessarily find in Glacier National Park. And you can see here on this figure that you have communities on the surface of the ice. You can have communities within these crevasses and moulins, and as well as beneath the glacier too. And these things, they can get flushed out, enter the streams. And so examples of this are like the ice worm. I don't know if some of you have seen these before. It's really cool. So how do we collect for microbes in the field? It's actually quite easy. So what we do is take a little filter like this one right here, and we attach it to the end of our tubing right here. And so we basically just attach the filter, and as we're filling up all of our water, which has to be filtered anyway for the isotopic analyses, what we're doing is catching all the microbes in that filter. So then we will detach the filter and fill up this plunger here with something called RNA later. It's basically like a preservation type of solution because we're in the field, like I said in the very beginning, for, we do field work in Mount Hood and then we drive all the way to Glacier and we're out for like a month long. So we don't really have access to refrigerators or anything like that. And we don't want the microbes to disintegrate at all or kind of like break apart. We want their DNA to be really like intact when we sample. So like I said, what we did was took the filters, injected RNA later, and then I went with my collaborator, Trinity Hamilton, to her lab, and she's a microbiologist. And we extracted the DNA from these filters. So as I mentioned before, I had two groups. I had a glacier contribution and a snow/rain contribution groups. And so what I did was took those two groups and took the samples from them and grouped the microbes from those samples. So samples that had greater than 60% glacial ice contribution, they are shown here. And samples that had less than 60% glacial ice contribution are shown here. So if you haven't seen a plot like this before, I'll break it down for you. So the dominant taxa in each of these groups is shown below. So this is at the genus level. So it's pretty specific. That's what all of these different taxa names are. So the abundance, which is the y-axis of this plot, is how much of that taxa is present. And the x-axis is the top 20 abundant OTU, which is OTU is organizational taxonomic unit. So basically what that means is we took the 20 most abundant taxa that were present in these glacier and snow/rain groups. And we pulled them up here because sometimes when you sample microbes, like imagine you just get one microbe versus, you know, I don't know, like 5,000. So we would want a bunch that are more abundant because they're just easier. It's easier to work with the data. And you know that it's not really like just like a fluke. Like these microbial communities are actually there. So any taxa with an abundance below 0. So here's the 0 axis right here and down here. It just means that it's extremely low abundance. So even though we looked at the top 20, we still have some taxa here that show up and they're still considered to be pretty low abundance. So we can ignore those. And there are taxa present in both of these glacier and snow groups here. I've connected them by arrows, which is pretty cool. So that means that these taxa are present both in glacially influenced springs and also in snow/rain influenced springs. So there's quite a few of them here. But there's also taxa that are present in only one group and not the other. So these taxa, they're unique to glacially influenced samples, like I said, and unique to snow influenced samples. So those are highlighted by these arrows right here. So in conclusion, pairing traditional isotopic end-member mixing models with microbial community populations is a really cool tool for assessing recharge from glacial meltwater. Approximately 30% of the spring samples that I collected are significantly influenced by glacial melt. And these microbial communities in these glacially influenced springs, they appear to be taxonomically distinct from the springs receiving most recharge from snow and rain. And then just the last thing here is that the role of alpine glacier meltwater in mountain block recharge and the structure of these microbial communities is more important than we previously thought. So I'm not sure how my time is. I probably should have started a timer, but if you're interested in seeing more details about this, I have a paper out on it that you can check out. And just some more future work here. So my collaborator, Trinity Hamilton, and I and some of her students, we're going to work together to do a more detailed microbiome study. So this was pretty surficial work. To include a full detailed study of that plus the hydro study, it would have just been too big for one paper. So we'll be working on that. I also have geochemistry for all of these springs, and I'm working through that. I have age dating and residence time data. So for those of you that are familiar, this is tritium, chlorine 36, C14, CFCs. So what I'll be doing is basically looking at, calculating how old potentially, or how long did it take from recharge, like the recharge point to the spring emergence, how long did it take for that water to travel? which could be really cool to look at in terms of sustainability aspects. I'm also working on a time series base flow study, so looking at just hydrographs strictly and using some statistics to pull apart different base flow aspects in these glacial streams. And this I wanted to click on really quick. Oh, of course it won't let me. Hold on.
You've got plenty of time, Jordyn. We're at 6:40, so there's plenty of time for questions.
Okay, perfect. Let me see if I can get it. Okay, so I had an undergrad work with me this semester, and we put together a website that basically shows what I talked through tonight. And it takes a little bit to load because it's pretty long. But I can link this or give it to Cindy. And it just goes through, like I said, exactly what I talked about tonight. And you can scroll through it. So, oh wait, did that not show up on your screen? It didn't.
Nope. Oh, now we can see it.
I'm sorry. Okay, so yeah, there we go. So it has a bunch of images and it's pretty interactive.
We'll definitely share that link, Jordyn.
Cool. Okay, and then back to the PowerPoint. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, to Cindy and the Hood River Watershed Group for hosting me tonight. And all of these different groups here, you know, you can't do anything without funding. So I've been really fortunate to get a lot of help to do this research. And there's some contact info if anybody wants to reach out to me. And so with that, I'll just take some questions, and it sounds like we have plenty of time for questions, so it's cool.
Let's see, do we want to, people can type questions in the chat box, or just unmute yourself, and it's not that big of a crowd. All right, so Brian Nakamura asked a question about how different is the microbiota from the Cascades and the Rockies? Like, is there more algae, ice worms, et cetera, in the different locations?
Okay, so let me see. Oops. I'm gonna stop sharing really quick and just see if my collaborator is here.
I guess I have to tag onto that, any difference in relative proportion of ice, or, you know, sort of the glacier melt versus sort of snow rainwater proportion in the the Glacier National Park samples.
Yeah, so hold on, let me pull up a picture actually. So, because basically, so for this presentation, I basically cut off all of the Glacier National Park stuff. So I have images already ready to go. I can just pull up a picture. Okay, so. And I'll share again. Okay, so this is from the paper. Oops. There's so many windows with Zoom. All right, so if we zoom in here, here is the Glacier National Park data, and here's the Mount Hood data. So you can see here, so these are really abundant. Like the taller the bar, the more abundant it is. And so you can see that this purple bar, and I will butcher all of these names if I try to pronounce them. I'm definitely not a microbiologist, but is this guy right here. And same thing, these yellow bars, they're present, in Glacier National Park and in Mount Hood. So we have this purple is here and here. We have the yellow is present here and here. So I'm not like I said, I'm not a microbiologist, so I can't answer all of your questions, but there are differences in the communities. They do look different, but there are definitely similarities too. Like on the one slide, I had an image of snow algae, for example. Snow algae is, we learned that it's pretty much everywhere. This stuff can like fly through the air. It's crazy, and it's all over different snowpacks. So that's something that you'll see in both locations. But there are definitely there's millions of different microbes, and we're just starting to scratch the surface with figuring out, are they endemic just to specific springs or like geographic differences. That's what this next paper is going to go into, is looking at, biogeography, stuff like that. Like I said, work in progress, but.
How about the relative proportion? Was there any kind of meaningful difference in terms between Glacier and Mount Hood on sort of the amount of in the spring water, the amount of glacier melt versus the surface melt?
So are you asking in Glacier National Park if what the proportions were like?
Yes, compared to Mount Hood.
Yeah, sure. So Mount Hood, there was definitely more influence from the glacial melt in the groundwater. So in Glacier National Park, you can imagine, I actually might have a picture of that here too. The landscape in Glacier National Park is very different from Mount Hood. So we have, with Mount Hood, you just have one cone basically. In Glacier National Park, you have these really high peaks, and the landscape, like I said, it's just really, it's really sharp. And so it will cut off those potential flow paths. So your glaciers are sitting up high on the peak of these mountains. And everything is cut so sharp, and the elevation gradient is really, really steep. And so it doesn't really give it as much of a chance to infiltrate into the bedrock there. So what I see a lot of times there is stratigraphic influence. So hold on, I really want to show you this picture. It makes things a lot easier to visualize. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this here. So this is a mountain, it's called Pecan Mountain in Glacier National Park. So the glacier is right here, and you can actually see from the satellite imagery, the stratigraphy is beautiful. It's very pancakey, unlike Mount Hood, which is just lava flows overlapping, and it's kind of crazy. So here you can witness there's huge springs that are popping out on the other side of the mountain here. So we have a glacier right here. And so what I think is happening is the water is literally just flowing along the stratigraphy and popping out on the other side, forming these really big streams. And that just flies down the mountain. And so, yeah, as you can see here, there's a lot, the geology, the difference in geology between Mount Hood and Glacier, there's a really big difference too. So Mount Hood is much more porous. The geology in Glacier National Park is really old, very laminated, like mudstones and things that are not, you don't really have a whole lot of porosity, basically, or permeability with these rocks. So it makes it harder to get that groundwater in and moving around and circulating within these mountains. I think much more difficult than in Mount Hood.
Okay, so then we have a couple of similar questions about on Mount Hood.
Sure.
Which spring, Mark Zan Miller asked, which springs are, let's see, losing my, there we go. Which springs are, sort of least more or less dependent on the glacial melt. And then Heather with Soil and Water Conservation District was asking similarly, which streams in the hood are rain dominated versus which streams or springs as well, because you have all those spring sites are rain dominated versus glacial melt dominated. And so is that in one of your, or is this in one of your papers, Jordyn, or could you share that specific data with us?
Yeah, sure. So all of that data, I put everything in tables. I'm very organized. So I have a database online. It's linked in my paper. So it's an Excel file that you can literally just download all of this data and the result from the mixing model too. So I have like fractional contribution for each individual spring. I have, I think I have YSI measurements. So like general water measurements for each spring, elevation data, GPS coordinates, of course. All of that is within that paper. So you can access everything there. But to answer your question quickly, so this map here shows that breakdown. So over here, this is Palmer Snowfield. So you guys know that they like salted that really heavily. And so it's not really a glacier anymore. It's just a snowfield. And you have up at the top here, the snowpack is pretty thick, but otherwise on this side of the mountain, it's pretty barren in terms of glaciers. So over on this side though, where Elliott is, there's a lot more glacier. It's on the shaded side of the mountain too. So aspect, it plays a big role in my work too. And same thing in Glacier National Park, we see the exact same thing. Shaded side of the mountain is where you have the glaciers. And then the southwest side is where all of the glaciers have melted away. So over on this side, like we zoom in, here's Elliott catchment. Here was that, the video I showed in the very beginning of Tilly Jane stream. That is this right here, this sample. And so, like I said, the ice is actually right beneath here, underneath all the debris. And so this one came out to be glacially influenced. This one here, I think I'm gonna butcher the name. It's like Palahi Creek.
Polly.
Palali. I say all of these in my head and I don't have anybody on the ground out there to check me all the time. So that's what the source is of that one. It comes out of this like headwater cut almost right here. I sampled that one time and I don't think I'll ever sample it again. It was so scary to get down there. So those are all really close to the glaciers. Out here, I sampled, oh gosh, I believe that one is, I have my own names for everything too. So these aren't like commonly known names. I called this one like Tilly Jane Spring, but it wasn't necessarily associated to Tilly Jane Stream. These down here, I don't know if you're familiar at all with like the warm springs in the area, but there's a couple of warm springs that pop out down near a campground, right down here. And those all, I think those are really deep regional groundwater flow. There's a paper, I think by Wallenberg in like the 60s that came out. And he also speculated they found like gases and things in those springs that they found in the fumaroles up at the top of the mountain. So we think those are really deeply circulating down here. But you can see for the most part, everything here, this is all snow influenced, snow and rain. And oops, my mouse keeps disappearing. Over here we had one, and I would like to point out this one too. So this is kind of an oddball. I called this one Bell Spring. I don't know if that's the real name for it. But what I did was sampled some of these springs. You can see they're really far away from Mount Hood. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to test if, like I knew, for example, this one, This one's not connected to Mount Hood. There's no way that it's connected to Mount Hood hydro, like through the hydrogeology. It's on a little butte, and the groundwater flow, it has to be local there. There's just, physically, I can't imagine how it would be connected to Mount Hood, because you have valleys within here too. But that just shows that this model, it can't be applied to huge regions. Isotope models like this, they're really useful if you're working on like a mountain scale. So I think just around the Mount Hood area, you don't have a lot of influence from other big topographic changes. I think it definitely works there, but you can't really extrapolate out without being careful.
So that is a good segue to the next question. Stuart asked sort of the relative, how far away you see glacial influence in these springs, or the sort of the source glacier, glacier water. So what's the farthest away that you observed glacially fed springs that you believe was real, as opposed to that one that you are certain is not actually coming from glacial recharge?
So I totally believe that these warm springs, that they definitely are. And then this one, that one certainly is as well. And these, I actually think these also are influenced by it. There's not a whole lot of crazy topography happening between the mountain and all the way over here. Things are pretty flat sloping down. And so I believe actually that one of those is Crystal Spring. I have to double check that just to make sure, but yeah, I had access to a couple water districts. They like showed me their springs, so that data is on there as well.
So is Greg Short was asking whether the elevation of the spring correlates positively with the relative contribution of glacier versus snow melt, glacier melt versus snow melt.
Mm-hmm. So I think it does, but it also, not just elevation, but it seems like aspect, like I said. So things that are on this side of the mountain, I think will be influenced more by the glacial melt than this side, simply because there's more glacier ice there that's able to be melted out. And I mean, of course, you're going to have like shallow flow happening up higher on the mountain as well, just because of like how hydrogeology works, right? Like you need to have that gradient in order to get the water in there deep to be able to give you that regional circulation. So up near the top of the mountain, I would say a lot of these are really shallow flow. Yeah, like local flow paths, quicker flow, versus things that we sample that's out radially farther away from the mountain.
And we put up the link to your paper just so everybody notes. You can look in the chat box and get the link to that, and which then sounds like links to your Excel data.
Yep, you can download it all right there. It's in a giant repository. I have pictures of every single spring too, and videos. Yeah,
awesome.
I had to make it as easy as possible to share all the data because I know that's what people want. So.
So you mentioned that your future work included aging of the samples. Is that something that is going to happen in the near term, or sort of undetermined when you might get to that?
I am working on
the residence time of particularly of the glacier fed springs.
Yeah, I'm working on that right now, actually. So I printed it out. It's like literally in my hand. I have some initial plots that are very cool, but so preliminarily, I'm seeing that those warm springs, they do look to be like old, according to the age dating. I don't have exact ages for anything yet, but they do completely pull away from like modern day precip, or we use like chlorine 36 because there was a bomb pulse signal that we can see in that. So that's back in like the 50s and 60s. So if we test water that has this bomb pulse in it, we know that the water is that old, if that makes sense, or around that time. And so let's see, Tilly Jane, Crystal Spring, it does come up that Crystal Spring has a component of bomb pulse in it. So, you know, it might give me different results than the isotope model, which, you know, it's really interesting to pair all of this stuff together. And I hope in my thesis, which I said should be done within like before the end of the year, I'll be pulling all of this data together to come up with results on each of these springs individually. So, yes.
It does seem like that has sort of longer term ramifications than for our, well, for our area, let's say like some of these springs, how long, you know, when or if the glaciers completely go away, how long will it be, you know, how long will those springs last and be around?
That's the exact question that I'm trying to answer. Yeah. Because if you have springs that are, you know, they're the headwaters of some of these really big rivers in the area, and they're depending on the glacial melt, which then is going away. Exactly like you said, it's like a sustainability problem. If there's insects and things like that living in that stream that other animals depend on, and that goes away, you know, or these microbes, it's like a chain reaction, right? And we don't exactly know if when the glacier melts away, if it will just be replaced instead by like snow recharge, and that, you know, maybe everything will be fine. We're not quite sure about that yet, but I think, like I said, the age data, I think that'll be really interesting to pick apart and kind of piece through.
I think there'll be a lot of us interested in that. So we'll have to figure out a way to, a good way to sort of get that information from you and share it with
I'll
people.
give it to you, no worries.
Very good, very
I'll share
good.
it right with you, yeah.
Can I ask a question without
Okay.
typing it in?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a long-winded question.
Sure.
So
Introduce yourself too, Dick. Introduce yourself. Yeah.
sure. So my name is Dick Iverson, and I'm a research scientist who spent my career at the Cascades Volcano Observatory.
Awesome.
And you know, something that has always been a little mysterious with regard to Cascade volcanoes is the groundwater situation, because we just don't have a lot of high quality data.
I agree.
So a question I have for you is, do your isotopic data potentially place constraints on sort of the complete water balance for Mount Hood? Meaning, really the question in my mind has always been how much deep recharge is there? And by deep, I mean stuff that's not showing up in these springs, but that could play a really vital role in the overall water balance for the Hood River watershed. So do you have any insights about that?
I think the isotopic data will definitely, you can use it in a water balance. I mean, I think it's useful. Something that in the paper, I highlight all of the pitfalls and, you know, things that I wish I could have changed, or if I lived there, how much more I could have sampled. I think sampling in the winter time and getting like fresh snowpack, and even like, you know, maybe bi-monthly or something like that, more snowpack samples throughout the year, during the winter months specifically, that could be really useful. It might actually even change the results of this study completely, because the mixing model is based on like that snow end member is based on when I go out there in the summer and there's leftover snowpack.
Right.
So, you know, if you think of snowpack overall, it can like melt from the top to the bottom. It can mix all the way through as things are melting, and the isotopes within that snowpack, they might vary too. So that's why I tried to get pretty representative across both sides of the mountain to try to get that zone. but also in where I sampled in Elliott Glacier too. So we found what I believe is like the exact toe of Elliott Glacier. So it should be the oldest ice that's there. It's covered with debris, and there was like a meltwater stream coming out, big exposure of ice. So I feel really confident about those samples that gives you a good end member for what is like the oldest ice on Mount Hood. Especially since it's, like I said, it's debris covered. So we know that it's not melting out like crazy. It's protected a little bit. But yeah, in terms of like a water balance, I think this data could be useful for that. I still like, I'm looking at the map right now and it's like, I wish I could have even more spatially dense, like a spatially dense study that I could have done. But it's just so hard when you get out there on foot to collect everything by hand, and accessing everything is really hard. That's like the whole northwest side of the mountain I didn't even get to just because we just couldn't get there.
Sure. I think your comment about the seasonal snowpack is a really important one, because undoubtedly all winter long, there's melting going on at the base of that snowpack all winter long. It's a thick snowpack, and with the geothermal heat flux, it's going to be melting all winter long. And when you've got, in higher elevations, you've got 15 or 20 feet of snow on the ground, that's a lot of potential recharge in a very diffuse fashion.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so we reached out, and I did submit a sampling permit to put up like snow collectors for one season, but I just never physically I wasn't able to actually put them in. So I was in touch with the Forest Service to get that done, but we just we couldn't get there in time just to collect. It was basically like a giant PVC pipe with a cone at the top. I know that's not perfect at all, but maybe we could have gotten something from it. But yeah, I totally agree. And in terms of like, if you just look at Mount Hood and compare the volume of glacier ice that's present there today versus the seasonal snow that you get every single year, I mean, you have way, way more snow that's happening. So yeah, I think it's probably really specific locations that you're seeing the glacial melt influence. Like I said, these warm springs, they definitely have a very regional like flow path associated to them. And I know I saw in the news, it was like maybe 2 years ago or something, that they found some new faults, I think along the northern side of the mountain. I am super interested to see if there's springs along there too, that would mimic maybe like the warm springs from the southern side. But like I said, my
Cindy, could I ask a question?
Yeah, please. You don't have to ask. Just
Jordyn, you did a lot of collecting of data on each spring in terms of the microbes and even the little bugs. What's the significance of that? And I wonder, is there a significance of that with the downstream effect of how that little ecosystem around the springs, does that track on down to the streams that eventually goes, any of those biota eventually get in the streams, so there's some significance relative to the stream ecosystem? Does that make sense?
No, I totally get what you're asking. So I think there is, and again, I'm not an expert in microbiology, but I think there's a break between like stream bugs, like things that you see, invertebrates that you see in the stream compared to microbes. Like they're not feeding directly on the microbes, but I think microbes can change like water chemistry and things like that. So I definitely, like, if you would see changes in the microbial communities, I can definitely understand that you would see downstream effects of this. But at the same time, I know that, your microbial communities, they can be really like a point source. So like where the water is coming out, where it's emerging, you might have one community there, And as you move down the stream and sample again, because, the stream, they can be really turbid, they can have different chemistry, even as you move along down the stream. I would imagine that your microbial communities could be different there too. We didn't do any like stream transect type of sampling work, so I don't have specifics on that, but I would say like it's definitely possible, yeah, that you could see downstream effects.
Else
I was
have,
curious, Jordan, if you drank from those springs.
Oh yeah, filtered first, but I already had the filter, so yeah, we would, like, if we were thirsty when we were sampling, we would literally just like take the filter and point it in the air and drink it. It's really nice being a hydrologist.
Jason, I'm wondering if you're on the call still. Jason Keller, we have another hydrogeologist in the room, so to speak, and I'm just curious, Jason, sorry, I can't get my screen to or see everybody. If you, in your experience with some, modeling you've done in the area, whether this all made sense or whether there's any aha moments.
I don't see him there anywhere.
Oh, maybe he had to drop off. Okay, well, never mind. That's the other thing about Zoom.
Something here, a question about the temperature of the warm springs. So I can answer that one really quick. So they were like about 25 degrees Celsius. So they were definitely warm. Like we put our hand in and it was definitely warm. They weren't, it wasn't like Yellowstone or anything. You wouldn't burn yourself on these. But I think that's just because you get a lot of mixing happening between this regional groundwater flow and then also the shallow flow from, rain that's occurring and snowmelt, things like that. I think the proportion plays a really big part in the temperature of the water. And I have not seen any Sasquatch while sampling.
I'm so glad you answered that question.
Yeah, I should have answered that one first. It was very important.
Okay, well, I don't think there's any other questions. If someone's got one, they better shout it quickly because we're gonna bring it to an end here. Let's see.
Chuck,
Why
I've got a
does
quick,
Alaska make up so much of the sea rise? From Stuart? Oh, sorry, Jordyn.
That's okay. So here, I'll try to pull up the slide again. Alaska, the glaciers there they're just melting really, really quickly. So, and there's a lot of ice up there too. Like if you think of the Pacific Northwest, you have individual like little volcanoes that have their own small glaciers on them. But Alaska, you have, it's like the Alps or something like that. Like you have a lot more ice available there to melt. And so here, let me share that picture again.
Last I knew, climate change was having a disproportionately greater effect on the poles, right?
Mm-hmm. That too, exactly. Yeah, so we have Alaska here, Western North America here, and then all along South America here. These are contributing a lot to global sea level rise. This paper is awesome too, if you guys haven't seen it.
Jordyn, go ahead.
Jordyn, a quick question. It may be very premature in terms of the time frame that your study's been going on, but can you have any feelings about how long will these springs last? Is particular with the changing weather patterns and climate change, any thoughts on, are these springs going to be here 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now? Or are they going to be gone?
Yeah, that's a great question. So spring permanence or impermanence is something that people in my lab are definitely interested in. Like my lab mates, they work in Death Valley, so they're working in really arid regions. I'm in the cold zones, but I would say like the springs that are at higher elevation and if they're receiving recharge from the glaciers, like a big proportion of that, yeah, I mean, potentially they definitely could be decreasing the amount of flow that they receive or outputting. But the thing is like that we just don't totally know yet is that transition period. Like, can the seasonal snowpack fill in where the glacier melt will be gone from, if that makes sense? Like, will that transition be enough to sustain the spring flow from some of these springs? And I just don't know, to be honest. That's why some of this like age dating tracer work that I'm working on, I think that will uncover a lot of answers about or questions about exactly what you're talking about. Knowing the residence times of these springs is really important.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're gonna bring the presentation to an end. So if folks can unmute themselves, maybe we can give a big round of applause to Jordyn. It was a great talk, very interesting, and we really appreciate it and wish you well on your defense. So.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.